Fear is the oldest weapon in politics, and in one of the most savage debates ever seen on live television, Piers Morgan ripped straight through Glenn Beck's entire playbook by exposing it for what it really was: fear-driven rhetoric dressed up as truth. From the very first exchange, Morgan refused to let Beck hide behind vague statements or exaggerated threats. He pushed, interrupted, and challenged him until the cracks began to show. Beck came prepared with his usual arsenal of dramatic warnings about America's future, conspiracies about looming dangers, and dire predictions meant to stir panic in his audience. But instead of nodding along like so many others do, Piers dismantled each point with calm, cutting precision. What made this debate so gripping wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the way Morgan pulled back the curtain on how Beck has built his influence. Beck's brand thrives on fear, whether it's the collapse of democracy, the destruction of family values, or the rise of authoritarian control. His rhetoric relies on painting worst-case scenarios and convincing his followers that only he sees the truth. Piers saw right through it, and he said what so many have been thinking for years: without fear, you'd have no audience. Without lies, you'd have nothing left to say. That line hit like a hammer. It wasn't just a clever retort, it was an unmasking, delivered live in front of millions, leaving Beck momentarily speechless. The beauty of this moment is that Morgan didn't just argue against Beck, he exposed the formula. He showed viewers in real time how fear-based punditry works: repeat the danger, exaggerate the threat, then present yourself as the only trustworthy guide. Beck tried to spin his usual narrative of patriotism under siege, but Morgan refused to let him skate by with emotional appeals. He demanded evidence, he demanded clarity, and every time Beck dodged, Morgan tightened the grip. The more Beck tried to raise the stakes with dire warnings, the more hollow it all began to sound. This clash wasn't just about two men arguing, it became a symbolic fight over truth in media. Beck represented the side of broadcasting that thrives on panic, thrives on division, thrives on convincing people that they should be terrified of what's around the corner. Morgan represented the voice of reason, calling out that fear is manipulation, and in that fiery exchange the audience could see just how fragile Beck's arguments really were when stripped of their emotional charge. What made the debate unforgettable was the dramatic rhythm of it all. Every time Beck ramped up, Morgan cut him off with sharp, surgical precision. Every time Beck threw out a line meant to inspire dread, Morgan turned it back on him. At one point, Beck accused Morgan of not understanding the real dangers facing America. And Morgan fired back: the only danger here is the danger of people like you, who keep Americans living in fear just to keep yourself relevant. It was a brutal line, and the audience knew they were watching something raw and unscripted. Social media exploded in the aftermath. Clips of the exchange went viral within hours, with countless viewers praising Morgan for saying what so many had wanted to shout at the television every time Beck spoke. Comment sections filled with people calling it the takedown of the decade, while others marveled at how Beck had finally been forced to confront his tactics instead of skating past them. Even critics of Morgan admitted that, in this debate, he struck a nerve that cut deep. But what makes this moment resonate beyond the clash itself is the larger question it raised: how much of modern media relies on fear to survive? Beck may have been the target, but Morgan's attack pointed to a much bigger truth about the way fear sells: fear of change, fear of others, fear of the future. And in calling it out so bluntly, Morgan reminded everyone watching that the antidote to fear isn't more shouting, but sharp truth spoken without hesitation. This wasn't just a debate, it was a demolition, a stripping away of the mask that so many figures like Beck hide behind. For once, the fear machine jammed on live TV, and the man who had built an empire on panic was left scrambling for words. That's why this clash continues to trend. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a revelation. Piers Morgan didn't just argue with Glenn Beck, he exposed him, and in doing so, he gave viewers the rare satisfaction of seeing fear itself get obliterated right before their eyes. Do you want me to write the next 700-word segment on the facts versus emotion angle in the same engaging narration style? And every great debate, there's a moment when the audience realizes it isn't just about two people exchanging words. It's about the battle between fact and emotion. That's exactly what unfolded when Piers Morgan went head-to-head with Glenn Beck. From the outset, Beck leaned hard on the emotional triggers that have always defined his style: urgent warnings, trembling tones of outrage, and appeals to patriotism that sound powerful but crumble under scrutiny. He painted pictures of doom, of America on the brink, of sinister forces tearing apart the nation. It was passionate, it was theatrical, but it wasn't grounded. And that's where Piers Morgan stepped in, refusing to let the drama overshadow the truth. Morgan's strategy was surgical. He didn't shout louder or try to match Beck's emotional fireworks. Instead, he cut through them with sharp, undeniable facts. Whenever Beck raised the stakes with sweeping claims, Morgan calmly demanded specifics. What exactly was the threat? Where was the evidence? How could Beck possibly back up his prediction? The brilliance of this approach is that it revealed the emptiness at the core of Beck's arguments. Without the emotional dressing, there was very little substance left to hold on to. One of the most striking exchanges came when Beck, in his familiar dramatic tone, warned that America was sliding into chaos because of radical movements undermining its foundations. It was the kind of line that usually draws gasps from his followers. But Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed him. What radical movements? Name them. Give me one clear example where your dire prediction has actually happened. Beck stumbled. He tried to shift, to redirect, to reframe, but Morgan kept circling back, each time demanding clarity. And with every failed attempt, Beck's emotional firepower looked more like smoke and mirrors. The tension in the room was electric. You could feel Beck trying to stir the audience with passion while Morgan held him down with logic. This wasn't just a debate of words, with a clash of styles. Beck embodied the broadcaster who thrives on stirring hearts, even if it means bending facts. Morgan represented the journalist who refuses to let emotion cloud the truth. That's why it resonated so strongly with viewers, because it wasn't just about what was being said, but about what it revealed. A stark difference in how influence is built. The more Beck relied on emotion, the more Morgan exposed the imbalance. For instance, when Beck accused the media of deliberately deceiving the public, Morgan countered with direct statistics on media trust, showing the real picture instead of feeding paranoia. When Beck tried to appeal to fear about government control, Morgan demanded data. Beck had none. Time and again, emotion clashed with fact, and fact stood taller. What makes this so captivating for viewers is that it flipped the script. Usually, Beck thrives by dominating conversations with intensity, leaving little room for fact-checking. But Morgan refused to give him that space. He slowed the pace, cut through the theatrics, and forced Beck into territory he wasn't comfortable in. Specifics. That shift created the most savage energy of the debate, because the audience could see in real time that Beck's confidence crumbled when faced with detail. And then came the knockout blow. The moment Morgan declared, "Without fear you'd have no audience. Without lies, you'd have nothing left to say." It wasn't just a witty line. It was the perfect encapsulation of fact versus emotion. In one sentence, Morgan told the truth that millions suspected. Beck's entire brand rests not on evidence, but on feelings of dread and panic. And when those feelings were stripped away by hard facts, there was nothing left. The fallout online proved just how powerful that moment was. People weren't just talking about Piers Morgan winning an argument. They were celebrating the triumph of fact over hype. Clips spread across platforms with captions like, "This is how you shut down fearmongering," and "Piers exposes Beck's hollow arguments." Viewers felt vindicated. They had watched, time and again, fear-driven voices dominate the airwaves, unchecked, but here live and unfiltered. One of those voices was held accountable. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a masterclass in debate. It showed that emotion can spark attention, but only facts can withstand scrutiny. And in this battle, the facts didn't just survive, they obliterated the emotion-driven narrative Beck tried to sell. That's why people keep rewatching it, because, deep down, they know they witnessed something rare. The moment when facts didn't just speak, they silenced. There are debates, and then there are moments that define them forever. In the clash between Piers Morgan and Glenn Beck, that defining moment came with a single line, sharp, devastating, and impossible to forget. After nearly an hour of Beck spinning his familiar warnings and Morgan cutting him down with counterpoints, the tension boiled to its peak. Beck, red-faced and animated, had just tried to paint himself as the lone truth-teller in a world full of liars. He insisted his warnings weren't fear-mongering but patriotic urgency. The audience leaned in, waiting for Morgan's reply. And then it came, delivered with a calm ferocity that froze the room. "Without fear, you'd have no audience. Without lies, you'd have nothing left to say." It was the kind of line that doesn't just end an argument, it defines it. Morgan didn't just rebut Beck. He stripped away his entire persona in less than 10 words. The silence that followed spoke louder than any applause. Beck's expression said everything, caught off guard, struggling to respond, suddenly aware that his armor of bluster had been pierced. In debates, timing is everything, and Morgan's timing was ruthless. He had let Beck talk, he had let him build, he had let him posture, and then he delivered. The kill shot. What made this line so lethal wasn't just the insult, it was the truth behind it. Beck's career has been built on stoking fear, framing every social change as an existential threat, and convincing his followers that catastrophe is always just around the corner. Morgan compressed all of that into one brutal observation, exposing the core of Beck's strategy. In that instant, the audience could see the emperor had no clothes. The debate wasn't about policies anymore, or even about facts versus emotions, it was about character. And Morgan had just revealed Beck's. Viewers who watched live knew they had seen history. The clip spread across social media in seconds, replayed and shared with captions like "Game over" and the line that ended Glenn Beck. Even those who had never followed either man found themselves gripped by the raw finality of the exchange. It wasn't just Piers Morgan being clever, it was him voicing what millions had suspected but never heard said so plainly, that Beck's empire was built not on truth but on manipulation. What made the takedown even more powerful was how Morgan delivered it. There was no shouting, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. He spoke it almost casually, like a judge handing down a verdict. That contrast calm precision against Beck's heightened theatrics made the line land with twice the force. Beck had been ramping up his energy, trying to dominate through volume, but Morgan's restraint made his words sting deeper. It was surgical, like a scalpel cutting through layers of noise to reveal the raw wound underneath. The aftermath was brutal. Beck tried to recover, launching into yet another emotional defense, but the magic was gone. Every word that followed sounded weaker, emptier, because the audience had already absorbed Morgan's line. It hung in the air like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. In many ways, the debate ended right there. Everything after was just filler. The quote had already been etched into the memory of everyone watching. That's the thing about defining lines. They don't just win debates. They become cultural touchstones. People quote them, meme them, repeat them in conversations long after the cameras stop rolling. Think of political debates where one sentence ends a candidacy, or courtroom moments where one phrase changes the outcome of a trial. That's what it happened here. Morgan didn't just defeat Beck, he created a line that will follow him for the rest of his career. And here's the deeper truth. People are hungry for clarity in a world drowning in noise. Beck represents that noise, emotional, constant warnings that something terrible is always on the horizon. Morgan gave people clarity, compressed into a single, devastating sentence. That's why it hit so hard. It wasn't just about Beck, it was about every voice that thrives on fear. And Morgan showed, in one stroke, how fragile that foundation really is for the audience. It was cathartic. They'd watched countless pundits like Beck spin doom and gloom unchecked. But here, live. One of them was finally cornered, finally exposed, finally silenced. That's why the moment trended. Why it was replayed endlessly, why it stuck. It wasn't just about winning an argument, it was about watching a mask fall off in real time. Years from now, when people talk about Piers Morgan versus Glenn Beck, they won't remember every exchange. They won't remember each statistic or counterpoint. They'll remember that one line because it wasn't just the highlight of the debate, it was the debate. And in that one savage moment, Piers Morgan didn't just obliterate Glenn Beck, he obliterated the entire foundation of fear-driven media, with nothing more than the sharp edge of truth. When the cameras cut and the debate was over, the real storm began not on stage, but online. Within minutes, clips of Piers Morgan's savage takedown flooded social media feeds, and the public backlash against Glenn Beck was instant, loud, and unforgiving. People weren't just talking about a heated exchange, they were celebrating a public unmasking. For years, Beck had built his empire on stirring panic, weaving narratives of danger that kept his audience hooked. But now, with one brutal line, Morgan had shattered that facade, and viewers weren't about to let it go quietly. Twitter lit up first, with hashtags like #PiersDestroyedBeck and #Fearmongering exposed trending worldwide. Users clipped the exact moment Morgan dropped the hammer. Without fear, you'd have no audience. Without lies, you'd have nothing left to say. And looped it endlessly, often over dramatic music or slow-motion edits that turned the quote into a cinematic mic drop. Memes sprouted overnight. Beck's stunned face paired with captions like "when you get called out on live TV" and "game over." TikTok stitched the moment into everything from reaction videos to satirical reenactments, with creators lip-syncing Morgan's words while pretending to collapse like Beck. What gave the backlash its intensity was the sense of release. Audiences had long grown weary of fear-driven punditry dominating the airwaves unchecked. Beck wasn't the only one doing it, but he had become a symbol of it. And now, live on television, someone had said what so many wanted to scream back at the screen. Social media comments read like a chorus. Finally, someone said it. We've waited years for this. That line ended him. The collective reaction wasn't just about watching Beck lose, it was about the catharsis of seeing fear itself lose. Mainstream outlets quickly picked up the buzz. Headlines like "Piers Morgan eviscerates Glenn Beck in viral debate moment," and the quote that shook Beck's empire dominated news cycles. Even outlets that usually aligned with Beck couldn't ignore the sheer volume of attention Morgan's takedown had garnered. Clips were replayed on late-night comedy shows. Commentators dissected the exchange frame by frame, and within 24 hours, the debate had transformed from a TV moment into a cultural flashpoint. The backlash hit Beck hardest among younger audiences who weren't deeply loyal to him. For them, the debate was their first real exposure to his style, and they weren't impressed. To them, he wasn't a truth-teller, but a relic of a media age where fear could go unchallenged. Comment threads on YouTube and Reddit skewered him mercilessly, mocking his lack of specifics, his stammering attempts to recover, and his over-reliance on theatrics. Some even compared the moment to watching the school bully finally get owned in front of the whole class. But the public response wasn't just ridicule, it was also reflection. Morgan's line sparked conversations about the role of fear in modern media. Podcasts and think pieces asked deeper questions. How much of what we consume is designed to scare us into loyalty? Why do fear-based voices gain traction in the first place? And what does it mean when an entire audience cheers, not just the defeat of a pundit, but the exposure of the tactic itself? Morgan hadn't just taken down Beck, he'd opened a broader conversation, and people were hungry to have it. For Beck, the backlash was brutal. His supporters tried to spin it, claiming Morgan had been disrespectful or bullying. But those defenses fell flat against the tidal wave of memes and clips. Every attempt at damage control was drowned out by the simple truth of the viral moment. He could go on air the next day, he could write op-eds, he could rally his fans, but nothing could erase that line, or the silence that followed it. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already delivered. For Morgan, the backlash was a windfall. He was hailed as the man who finally stood up to fearmongering and won. His credibility soared among audiences tired of sensationalism, and even those who normally disliked him admitted he'd landed a blow for truth. The clash gave him not just a viral victory, but a reputation boost, proof that he could do more than provoke headlines. He could deliver them. What makes the public backlash so important is that it transformed a single debate into a lasting cultural memory. People will forget the smaller exchanges, but they'll remember the way Beck was cornered, the way the internet erupted, the way that one line became a rallying cry. It wasn't just entertainment, it was vindication. For once, fear wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Truth was, and that's why this debate is remembered not just as a clash, but as a reckoning. In the aftermath, it wasn't just Glenn Beck who faced backlash, it was the entire machinery of fear-based media. And that machine, at least for one unforgettable night, was silenced by the sharp edge of a single sentence.